Theory and Theology. What's up? I'm excited. I came across something cool. I didn't think I'd find it, but I did, and I hope you guys will enjoy this. I'm gonna break it up into shorter parts. So I guess this episode we're gonna talk about Jesus in the Talmud. Some information about Jesus in the Talmud, or potentially information where Jesus was potentially mentioned in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud, I guess for people who may not know at all what the Talmud is, let me look it up. Let's see what Wikipedia, our bestie Wikipedia, has to say. It says Talmud, teaching, is, after the Hebrew Bible, the central text of rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of religious law, which is called halakha, and Jewish theology. Until the advent of modernity, in nearly all Jewish communities, the Talmud was the centerpiece of Jewish cultural life and was foundational to all Jewish thought and aspirations, serving also as the guide for the daily life of Jews. Usually is referring to the Babylonian Talmud or the Talmud Bavli, compiled in the 5th century by Rav Ashi, Ravina II. There's also the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is the Jerusalem Talmud. You also hear the word shas. I've heard the word shas. I never knew that's what that meant. So basically it says the Talmud has two components. The Mishnah, which was written in 200 CE, or near 200 CE, which would be AD, 200 AD. A compendium of the Oral Torah, and the Gemara, circa 500 CE or 500 AD. And elucidation of the Mishnah, and related Ta'anaitic, I don't know what that means, writings. Talmudic traditions emerge within the literary period that can be bracketed between the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE or 70 AD until the Arab conquest in the early 7th century. So 200 CE. So the Mishnah is a written text based on the Oral Torah. Now, I guess in Jewish tradition it's believed that, on Mount Sinai, Moses was given the 10 Commandments as well as the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They're called different names in Hebrew. And those 5 books are the Torah, but also there's the Oral Torah. And so I have to look up some words. What does compendium mean? Compendia or compendiums, a comprehensive collection of information and analysis pertaining to a body of knowledge. So basically it was a compilation of knowledge, which was the oral Torah, was written into what's called the Mishnah. And the Gemara, which is an elucidation of the Mishnah, countable or uncountable, I don't know what that means, making clear, the act of elucidating, or that which elucidates, as an explanation, an exposition, an illustration. We'll go with illustration. It illustrates the Mishnah. I don't know what Tanaim. Let's see. Tanaim, or repeaters or teachers, were rabbinic sages whose views were recorded in the Mishnah. So basically it's saying the Mishnah is basically a compilation of what the oral Torah was. It's not like maybe the full exact word for word. I don't really know. And then the Gemara, I don't know, is the essential component of the Talmud, comprising a collection of rabbinical analyses and commentaries on the Mishnah, and presented 63 books. So analyses and commentaries on the Mishnah. So the Mishnah was written based on the oral Torah, and the Gemara, which is the essential component of the Talmud, the Gemara is basically based on the Mishnah. And the reason why I wanted to put that out there is because I have a hard time explaining all this. So let's just get the definitions. And in a previous episode, I did kind of mention some things where I was saying, like, I want to go into these topics, but I wanted to not be paraphrasing. So I was like, let me just find the video that talked about those references, and then find those references and read the references. Now that is turning out to be harder than I thought it was going to be, but I think I've come to something. So basically, the reason why I wanted these years is to kind of pinpoint, the timeline based on Jesus. And so Jesus would have been living, the first, I guess the death of Jesus was near, 33 AD or something like that. 33-ish. I don't know. I don't think anyone knows the exact time. But let's say 33, approximately, give or take some years there. That's where Jesus dies or is crucified, or whatever version of whoever's version people take from that, because I believe Muslims don't believe Jesus was crucified. I don't think. But anyways, Jesus would not have been alive yet at the time that the Talmud was written, but the oral Torah would have already existed, and the oral Torah would have already existed since Mount Sinai, according to tradition. And then in about 200 years after Jesus was on earth, that's when the Mishnah was composed, which was the written version of some compiled information from the oral Torah. And then you wait 300 years and you have the Gemara. So you have that main part of the Talmud, the Gemara. So basically it's all based on the oral Torah. And if you read the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, I don't know if it's within the whole Hebrew scriptures, there's 613 commandments, or within the Torah alone, there's 613 commandments. But either way, I want to say it's within the Torah, there's 613 commandments. And Christians have access to the Torah. It's in the beginning of the Old Testament. Christian Bibles usually have an Old and New Testament, or Old Testament, New Testament, and Apocrypha. And the Old Testament starts with the first 5 books of the Bible, which is the Torah. Now, is it the same exact translation? There's some places here or there where you see footnotes where it's like, this is from the Masoretic text, or not in there, or this is from some other new scroll. Some other scroll has this, and this isn't in these other scrolls. And so, like, there is some discrepancy and some translation discrepancies with Christian Bibles, and the Torah in the Christian Bible usually isn't the same exact as you would find with, like, Jewish Publication Society, JPS, or like a Chumash, like a stone Chumash, or Art Scroll, the Chumash version of, with the Rashi and the commentary, the English translations and those types of Hebrew texts usually does have some differences. Now, are those differences going to be like deal breakers? That's what I'm not really 100% sure about. And I'm also not sure why Christians don't learn about the Oral Torah or the Mishnah or the Gemara or any of the other Hebrew texts, because those aren't the only Hebrew texts that exist. It's not just the Bible. There's other Hebrew texts. There's a bunch of other Hebrew texts. And so, I mean, I guess you could even consider the New Testament to be a Hebrew text, like a text of Jewish culture, even if it is kind of like not traditional Judaism, but it's some Jewish thinking in the early days that eventually became what is now Christian thinking. But it was considered like some form of Jewish thought, but it wasn't written until way after the death of Jesus. But and that's a whole history in and of itself. But I guess that's a long enough intro. Let's dive kind of into some of this stuff. So Jesus would have been Jesus. I just want to keep that timeline pretty clear, that the information that we're dealing with here in the Talmud is based on something with roots all the way back to Moses on Mount Sinai. But it's commentary of multiple rabbis and sages about the Oral Torah, about the Mishnah. But it's like a lot of this stuff is in the Torah, but it's basically, the Mishnah is like a very expanded version. So it's like, say for example, in Exodus 20 you have, the law about the Sabbath. The 4th commandment talks about the Sabbath, remembering the 7th day, keeping it holy. 6 days shall you labor, do all your work, but in the 7th you shouldn't do any work, not you or your manservant or maidservant or alien in your gates and all this kind of stuff. No one in your household is supposed to do work, because in 6 days the Lord created the earth and rested on the 7th and hallowed the Sabbath day. The day was hallowed, made holy, sanctified by God, basically. And you don't really need much more reason. That's just what it says. And there's other passages about the Sabbath, but that's one of multiple. But then in the Talmud, there's a whole book about the Sabbath. There's a whole book about it. It's not just like, okay, a couple verses here, a couple verses there. As far as the laws of the Sabbath within the Torah, it is written there more than once, but I mean, it's not like a whole book with all these rabbis and sages like commenting on it and like, well, you can do this and you can't do that. Like, all it really says in the Bible, in the Torah, is like the work part. It doesn't have all this other stuff about the lights and all these other, like, all these other aspects that you would never know about if you only read just what the Torah says. There's these other things that Christians don't really touch most of that. The only people who kind of touch it are maybe theology majors, because they have to learn about it sometimes, and or maybe like historians or archaeology type people or anthropology people in those types of fields. There are some learned aspects of Christianity where you might touch on it, or maybe even like Messianic Jews might, just with their love of Jewish culture, and some of the other Christian branches that kind of have maybe more of an open-mindedness to learning about the Jewish traditions. You might see that come up there. But otherwise, you don't really see it come up too much. Most Christians don't touch the Talmud. They don't even touch the commandments, or even the 10 Commandments. And so and if they are touching the 10 Commandments, it's not like the Sabbath and those types of commandments. It's like other commandments, like the not killing and like the basic, like don't kill, don't steal, that kind of stuff. But they'll be like using passages from the New Testament to quote and say that we don't have to follow this, we don't need to follow it because Paul, or some interpretation of something that they believe Jesus said or whatever. But in the New Testament, you can almost assume, other than the people who were Gentiles that converted, people were Jewish and they were keeping the Torah back then for the most part. There was still some argument about like, oh, these people are breaking the Sabbath, or these people are breaking this or that rule or this law, or the Pharisees and the scribes and people were on some of the New Testament characters about like, why aren't they doing it this? Why don't they wash their hands? Like, why do you sit and have meals with these people? Why do you entertain company with these people? Why are you letting your disciples pick grain? There were some complaints that came from, okay, traditionally, that's maybe not how those ultra religious Jewish people were doing it in that culture. So they were questioning, okay, why is there this rabbi over here who has disciples and who's Jewish and has Jewish disciples, and they're all running around doing all these other things that our disciples don't do and that we don't do and that traditionally we don't do. But it seems like that isn't uncommon to have these kind of like different groups in Judaism. I mean, even if you look at Hasidic culture, how many types of Hasidic Jews are there? There's so many, and they all have, they're all following the same books, but when you dig down into it, there's all these different interpretations of these different things, that are based on this law versus that law versus that law, and people quoting these different rabbis and sages, and like, which midrash do you follow? Like, whose teachings are you following? And backing it up with something that you've read somewhere, not just doing it because this is what the church taught you and I heard it in a sermon somewhere. Like, look it up in a book and quote which rabbi said that. That is something that I find is pretty different in Jewish culture compared to Christian culture. You don't really see in Christian culture often the whole like, well, I do this because the Bible or whatever text or whatever person says this or that, and I follow those teachings. A lot of times it's like, I heard this thing at church and never went and looked it up, and then like Greg Laurie said this, or like some other bigwig kind of person like said that other thing over there. But it's like, is it based in a scripture? And are the scriptures trustworthy? I mean, those are bigger questions. Because there's been some manipulation of things over time for different reasons. Some of it was to try to preserve what was possible to preserve of Jewish culture, because, of Christian culture going around trying to kill all the Jews and trying to, burn all their books and get rid of all their stuff. And so there was some manipulation of the Talmud for that reason. And I've heard there was some manipulation within other types of texts too. In the New Testament, you hear that. You hear a lot about that. And so it's kind of like, and then is the Apocrypha accurate or not? And like, which books were canonized and why? Like, there's all these questions when it comes to texts where it's like, okay, yeah, there are some groups that, they're like, well, if you can't back it up with a valid text, then we're not really gonna follow that. But it's like, what makes a text valid, if it's been manipulated? And that's where, faith comes in, and an extra study and a lot of extra historical study and kind of just knowing the history of some of these documents and books and literature. Just knowing the history of it helps, So I'm gonna read some of a part of the Talmud where it talks about. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud, from Sanhedrin 43a. Is that what I'm even reading? Let me check my notes. Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin 43a. So this is supposed to be about Yeshu hung on the eve of Passover and being guilty of witchcraft. Now there's some debate about if this is Yeshu as in Jesus or if it is not, because I think they say that this person Yeshu had a teacher, Yeshua ben Prachia. And I learned this from this rabbi from Jews for Judaism. There's a YouTube channel called Jews for Judaism, and I'll post that link. And he basically explains that Jews for Judaism, he basically explains that there was some stuff removed so that the books weren't destroyed by Christianity. So there's a book that if I can get the name for it, because the way he says it, I don't know how to spell it. I'm gonna try to type out the name in the description, or at least phonetically how he's making the name of this book sound. I'm gonna try to type out this name. I don't know if I can find the link for it, but I'll try to type out this name or see if he put a link for that book. It's a book that shows the parts that were actually removed from the Talmud. I don't know if it says the reasons why, but it shows that they were removed, and the reasons why they were removed. I don't know all the reasons, but I don't know if it was all during that same time period of persecution, but basically some people think that this information doesn't meet the timeline criteria because there was information removed. Some people think this is talking about a whole different person, that Yeshu isn't Jesus, and because the rabbi that this Yeshu individual was studying under, his name was Yeshu ben Prachia, and Yeshu ben Prachia lived like 100 years or so before Jesus even existed, and so the timeline wouldn't add up because people back then weren't living like that long. They weren't living to be like 100. Yeshu ben Prachia would have had to be like probably like 112 years old to have Jesus as a student at like 12 years old or so. Um, Even if the years are like 50 years off, it still doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, even if it was just like a couple decades later, because people weren't really living that long. Um, to a point where during Jesus' whole life, Yeshua ben Prachia would have been alive if Jesus lived for 30 years or so. So just timeline wise, historical timeline wise, it doesn't really match. But okay, so I didn't really thoroughly read all of this. I am interested to read all of this, but I did not. I was just reading till I found the part that starts talking about potentially the part about Jesus. So a lot of it was talking about, I guess at the beginning, someone getting stoned for some kind of like how if someone's condemned, or different topics about witnesses and someone being stoned to death or like killed, and the courts and kind of their roles and all this. Like it's basically a lot of explanations about that type of topic. So I want to read from like a paragraph before it starts mentioning the parts that sound like it might be from Jesus. Now these translations, this part does have the word Jesus, the Nazarene. It does say that in here. There's also Hebrew that says, I don't know if I can translate this Hebrew. I don't know. That's a lot of Hebrew, guys. So basically I'm going to just read the paragraph before and keep going until it seems like it's no longer talking about that topic, because these topics blend into one another. But I will eventually go back up and read the whole thing. Just not to you guys. I'll just read it while I'm here. So this is Sanhedrin 43a from the William Davidson Talmud. This is a Babylonian Talmud. It says the Mishnah. I remember we learned what the Mishnah was earlier. The Mishnah teaches that a crier goes out before the condemned man. This indicates that it is only before him. That's in some of these phrases and terms are bold. And I'll post the link. You'll have to scroll down quite a while past. I'm reading past section 20 or verse 20. I don't know if it's called verses or what, because this is multiple sentences. But we'll call it verse 20. It has the numbers on the Hebrew text, and then the English is right under that. So the Mishnah teaches that a crier goes out before the condemned man. This indicates that it is only before him, i.e., while he is being led to his execution, that yes, the crier goes out. But from the outset, before the accused is convicted, he does not go out. The Gemara raises a difficulty. Now we know what the Gemara is. When you see it say Gemara, we know what that means. So we're talking about the Mishnah, we're talking about the Gemara. The Gemara raises a difficulty. But isn't it taught in a Baraita? I don't know what that means. On Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene after they killed him by way of stoning. And a crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming, Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Anyone who knows of a reason to acquit him should come forward and teach it on his behalf. And the court did not find a reason to acquit him, and so they stoned him and hung his corpse on Passover Eve. Now in the Hebrew, I'm trying to see if it talks about, if it says Jesus the Nazarene. I don't know if I'm seeing it. I don't know. I'd have to go back through so much of this. My Hebrew is not good enough to just pull words really quick, and especially it doesn't have the vowels, so I see Pesach at the end, so I know we're in the right place. But Erev HaPesach, so I see that part at the very end. I'm just trying to see if it says... I'll look at this later. I said that before, that I was going to look at it later. I'm going to have to look at that later and see if I can pick out the words. Because the version that the guy read from Jews for Judaism, it used a different word. It didn't say Jesus the Nazarene. I think it said Yeshu. And then the word for Nazarene was Nazeh or Nazaire or something like that. I don't know. Anyways, we can keep going. It says, Ullah said, and how can you understand this proof? Was Jesus the Nazarene worthy of conducting a search for a reason to acquit him? He was an inciter to idol worship, and the Merciful One states, with regard to an inciter to idol worship, neither shall you spare, neither shall you conceal him, from Deuteronomy 13:9. That's the law that talks in the Torah about idol worshippers. It says, rather, Jesus was different, as he had close ties with the government, and the Gentile authorities were interested in his acquittal. Consequently, the court gave him every opportunity to clear himself, so that it could not be claimed that he was falsely convicted. And then it says, apropos the trial of Jesus, the Gemara cites another Baraita where the sages taught, Jesus the Nazarene had 5 disciples. Okay, I'll look at that one in a different section, because this is a whole different thing, and I'm still kind of learning what this one says. But okay, Sanhedrin 43a. Now, I guess what they say, the issues... So this is my first time reading this with my own eyes and mouth. This is my first time reading this. Now, what I initially did was I went on that... I listened to that lesson by the rabbi who runs... the rabbi who runs Jews for Judaism, the YouTube channel. Now, I could have just gone by his word of mouth and by what he says, because he was reading this from a text. He wasn't like, I think he was reading it. Wasn't he reading it? Now I don't recall if he was reading it. Or if he was reading his notes. I don't really know. But I know the version he read did not say Jesus the Nazarene. It didn't say it that clearly. And this also doesn't talk about the teacher that would have been Yeshu's teacher, Yeshua ben Prachia. Now, he does talk later on, this rabbi from YouTube does talk later on, saying that, what was I saying? He does say later on that there is some discrepancy, some Jewish people believe that the Talmud's explanation of this Yeshu or Jesus or whatever translations come up for that name or person, that is accurate to who Jesus was, and that's the real story of Jesus. But then when you go to the New Testament, you don't see this story in the New Testament. This isn't a New Testament story. There's nothing in the New Testament about Jesus worshiping idols. Even in the parts where the Pharisees are getting on his case, I don't recall there being a complaint about him worshiping idols. There were complaints about him breaking different laws, but not that one, not worshiping idols. And there was some dispute, whenever Jesus was confronted with, why are you doing this? Or you're breaking the law, or you're breaking our tradition. He would come back with some kind of response. But I guess what gets me is oftentimes those responses that Jesus gets are so, the responses given by Jesus are often just so, hard to understand, in my opinion. And I'm saying my mind is limited, so I don't know everything. I will challenge things, but I'm coming from my own perspective sometimes too, so you gotta remember, who am I? I'm nobody, I'm nobody. I'm just a person that likes to geek out on these topics and read the stuff and encourage people to read it. If it interests you and you want to kind of dig into stuff, I find it to be fun. This is how I prefer to study things, is okay, one topic leads to another topic, leads to another topic. It is kind of like a bottomless pit of study, but I like that. But the more questions you try to answer in that method, you often find more questions than you find answers. And then there's all these different branches of different questions coming off of one question. And, eventually it's okay, now I got to organize it in a way where I can kind of make more sense in reading through it. And I've been wanting for a while to kind of read this. I just never sat down and did it. So today I was like, let me leave the house and look this up. And luckily my internet's good enough in this spot where I'm sitting outdoors to be able to enjoy a morning outdoors and read this stuff. And learn from it and see kind of what comes from it. Now, let's look at the parts that I just read and see what it says about some things that would be different from the New Testament. Now, some of this is coming from that rabbi, some of it's coming just from my own knowledge, from what I've learned and what I've read of the New Testament. I've never heard any of this stuff about a crier goes out before the condemned man. That is supposed to be found in the Mishnah. Now, where is that found in the Mishnah? I don't know. I've never looked that up. But if it's in the Mishnah, that means it comes from the oral Torah. If it comes from the oral Torah, it's probably somewhere in the Torah, which I don't really know for sure if I'm seeing that correctly. That anything that's oral Torah, well, I guess the oral Torah expands more on the Torah, but there should have been some initial part of the Torah that might have explained this Mishnah part. But I don't really know that for sure. I've never heard of that before. But as far as like laws, there are a lot of things in the Old Testament that like are kind of like over my head. Because even though I did grow up studying it, I would say I definitely heard way more of the New Testament than I did the Old. And with the Old Testament, the focus when I was learning was more on like the stories, like the storylines and like, okay, creation happens and Noah, and eventually you get like to Joseph and all these other, like Moses and all these other things. But it was never like dive into the laws other than the 10 Commandments and some of the like dietary restrictions. And then some people argue about the stuff in Leviticus about LGBT, or is that what it even means or what it says or whatever. But I've heard like a few things from Leviticus because I was raised in a culture that, you know, has some dietary laws based on what it says in Leviticus. And then the LGBT stuff just comes up naturally. If you're part of Christian culture, it just comes up. That's where you hear Leviticus and then the 10 Commandments in Exodus. But it's not like we're studying like everything in Leviticus and everything in Deuteronomy. Like this quote from Deuteronomy 13:9 where it says, "Neither shall you spare, neither shall you conceal him," when it's talking about someone who is an inciter to idol worship. I don't think I've ever dove deep into that in any kind of Christian setting where it's like we're talking about not worshiping idols. Like, people are taught don't worship idols, but I can never remember one sermon or service where we were talking about idol worship. I think the only thing that would usually come up would be like internet usage or money and consumption and like having a lot of belongings, and that was considered like idols. It wasn't like, oh, don't have money and don't buy stuff or don't go on the internet. It wasn't like that extreme, but it was like that's kind of where in Christian culture in modern day in Los Angeles people were, if you hear a pastor talking, they would say that that's kind of like the modern day version of like idol worship. They don't really talk about, you know, a statue or sitting and bowing down to like an actual idol. And I do remember going to a Hindu temple with a friend, and I was like, this is a really cool spot. And then I remember one of my friends, this was like in grad school, and that friend kind of, I think it was a date actually on Valentine's Day, and we went, and, you know, this person was like, you know, do you want to, I don't know if it was like light an incense or do like I don't know, there was like some kind of ritual in some little spot. And they were asking, oh, do you want to do this? And I was kind of like, no. Like, in my mind, I was like, this is idol worship. That's the first time. That's probably the first and only time I've ever come into something where I've actually been like, oh, this is idol worship. And I'm not saying, I mean, people follow, I'm not saying don't follow that religion or whatever. If that's what you like and that's what appeals to you, then so be it. Like, who am I to say don't do that? But I'm just saying, like, it's not like it comes up in my life a lot where it's like I'm in a space where I'm tempted to like bow down and worship something or pray to it. It never happens. It's not really part of like my culture, you know, to do that, to actively in a prayerful way bow down and be worshiping something and praying to it and being like, oh, I'm expecting that this idol or that this other God that I'm praying to of these other people's God is gonna like be in contact with me or like help me with something or like connect to me or whatever. Like, one time ever in my life, it's been like once ever. And I think there was another time where one of my friends invited me to their Buddhist temple, and I got a little defensive about it, and I was like, I don't really want to go. Like, temples are kind of boring. And I think I kind of, like, offended them, even though I really did want to go, but I felt like I would be tempted to kind of be doing all kinds of activities that I didn't really know what it was, and maybe I'd feel bad about it. And this is at that time. Now I might be more open-minded to kind of, like, sit there and, like, observe and be there, but at those times I was like, no, I will not do that practice at the Hindu temple, and no, I will not go to your Buddhist temple. because I didn't really know how to really approach that. Now there are things in the field of psychology as far as like meditation and, different types of like yoga poses and things like that, that, some circles of Christianity are a little bit like, this Eastern culture stuff, don't get too involved in it. Now people aren't doing it in like a religious, spiritual way necessarily, but it's not that far removed, like your mental and emotional health isn't that far removed from your physical health, your spiritual health. You can't just be like half falling apart all the time, and some of the things like the breath work and all these other things are helpful. They do have benefits, even if you're not doing it as like a religious practice. But some of these things do come from other spiritual practices that are not necessarily in the Bible that way. Like, I don't know if you find yoga in the Bible. Maybe you do. I don't know. I've never seen anything like that. But I was always taught that like yoga and those other forms of like meditation and martial arts and all. I was always taught like, look out, like people experience weird things. You might hallucinate. You might open your mind too much to a place where you let in some evil spirit or something. And I don't know where that comes from, but those were the messages I got. And if I got those messages, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person who was raised in a Christian culture who got those messages. So I know when I was in the field of psychology kind of earlier on and people were like, oh, yoga and meditation and all this, it was kind of when all the Eastern thought was kind of getting more incorporated into the psychology field. Not as a spiritual practice, but more as like, let's just take the techniques and benefit from the techniques, but you're not necessarily praying to anything when you're doing it or like worshiping anything. But there is some debate. I like the school where I did go to, I think they were having some of the kids do some yoga and meditation in the classes, and there were some parents that complained about it because they don't believe in it. And it is a fine line to walk, though, because it's like, okay, this is another cultural thing. It's almost like, what if you told your kids, we're going to do the Muslim call to prayer and pray 5 times a day at the same time that Muslims pray, but we're not going to do the prayer and we're not going to say the part that says Muhammad is his prophet, but we're going to do we're going to do the call to prayer and we're going to skip that sentence, and then we're going to pray 5 times a day and do the same motions, the bowing, the standing, the prostration, and all these different types of movements, but you're praying to God of the Bible. And in Christianity, you're saying in Jesus' name, so you're kind of praying to Jesus too, or Mary, or whatever if you're Catholic. But we're going to do this. It's kind of like, it can be a fine line when you start incorporating other things. And when I say fine line, I mean, it's like, where does one thing start and the other thing end and a new thing begin? It's like, there would be plenty of people that would be like, don't do that. If you're not Muslim, don't do that as your Christian prayer. Don't do the call to prayer in the same tone as the Muslim call to prayer, and it's too close. Even if it is all related to, maybe you're reciting scripture from the Bible, don't do it. People would say don't do it. Like, that's too close to Islam. You're not practicing Christianity, even though technically in motion none of it would be Muslim, like a Muslim tradition, other than like the praying 5 times a day, the times when you do it, and then using the call to prayer. And if you do that in Arabic, but say if you're only quoting from Christian scriptures and the prayer you're doing, say it's the Lord's Prayer, I don't know, just saying it over and over and over again, but just doing all the bowing and all that kind of stuff, like, people would probably be like, oh, don't do that. Like, there's something wrong with it, even if it's, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, there is a fine line between, where one thing starts to morph into some other thing, But, you know, I don't know. I don't even know what I think about that. But I'm making stuff up. I've never heard of anybody doing that in my life. It actually sounds kind of cool. But I mean, I've never heard of anybody actually doing it. But I have heard about the concerns people have about meditation and prayer and stuff like that. I've definitely heard that in my life. And I've not had a lot of opportunities to bow down and worship idols. So it is kind of interesting when you read texts about, oh, like someone worshiping idols. I never heard anything in the New Testament about Jesus worshiping idols, or even anybody complaining that he's worshiping an idol. There was a complaint that he was making himself equal to God, but not bowing down to idols. So I haven't seen that ever. And in our culture, in mainstream Western culture, it doesn't seem to come up like super often in a way where you would be like, oh, like, you know, this is what we're doing, you know. So the idol worship or inciter of idol worship, like encouraging other people to worship idols, I have never heard that in the New Testament at all. Like that. So these can't both be accurate, right? It can't both be accurate that Jesus said that, or maybe it's just omitted from the New Testament and just nobody ever wrote it down. Because mind you, these books of the New Testament, the Gospels, were not published while Jesus was living. Jesus didn't write a gospel that we know of. These Gospels weren't written like as journals while they were traveling around and while Jesus was even alive. Like these, you know, the Gospels were all published way later, decades later. I think the first book of the New Testament written was Galatians. Am I wrong? I might be wrong. And then the first gospel written was either Mark or Luke. And these were like between 40 years, like the year 40 and the year 60 or something. Like none of this was like any time during while Jesus was even living. And so it's possible that they left it out and nobody wrote it. And then you see this story in the Talmud. But it's also possible that this was a different person. Is this even Yeshu? Is this Yeshu? Is it even Jesus? That's a debate that we don't even know. You know, is this even the same person? Because it says Jesus the Nazarene, but the name Jesus is very popular. According to this, the rabbi in that YouTube video, the name Jesus at that point in time, not Jesus, but I guess Yeshu, Yeshua, Yehoshua, if that's even the same name or variations of the same name or nicknames or something, that name was popular. Now you kind of see the name Jesus, but you don't really see a lot of people named Jesus. I don't even know if you see a lot of people named Yeshua. Josh, yes. Joshua, Yehoshua, yes. But I don't know if I've seen a lot of people named Yeshua. Probably a lot of Jewish people don't name their kids Yeshua because of how it might be relevant to Jesus. And yeah, and I guess there's other terms like is Isa or Isas. Is that the name of Jesus in Arabic? Because there are people by that name. But anyways, okay, so that can't all be true. Something's wrong. Basically, we know something's wrong. Either something's missing in the New Testament, or this is the wrong Jesus, or the name is wrong, or the person is wrong. Something is wrong. Something is not. This can't all be right. Something is wrong somewhere. Either it got left out of the New Testament or something, or this isn't even the right person. Or this is right and the New Testament accounts of Jesus are all wrong. or partly, there's partial right things on all ends. And none of the full information is maybe there. That's possible too, but I don't really know. I'm not here to make people like doubt. I'm just looking at this because it's so interesting. I forgot what I was reading. That's too far up. I think I skipped something. Sorry, guys. I skipped the whole. So I'm not going in order. That part was not in order. The part that I was reading from was 21. 20 is the place where I'm trying to start. And looking at what's similar with the New Testament or not similar. So we'll skip that part of 21 that I already just read. Now, I've never heard in the New Testament about somebody going 40 days. Sorry, let me go in order. Sorry. Yeah. This part where it says the Mishnah teaches that a crier goes out before the condemned man. The Mishnah may teach this. I don't know if the New Testament shows any proof of that. I might be wrong. I don't know where I would find it. It would have to be somewhere in the Gospels. And it says, on the eve of Passover, they hung the corpse of Jesus, the Nazarene, after they killed him by way of stoning. Now, that is not something you hear in the New Testament. Nobody said, okay, Jesus being killed on the eve of Passover, not all of the Gospels say this. Now, there are Gospels where it does say this, and there are Gospels where the timeline is different. If you look at it, some of them say he was killed on the eve of Passover. Some of them say it was, I think, not that day. It was like the day of Passover or the day after Passover or something. It was a different day, basically. We're looking at different days. So it was either the eve of Passover, and the significance that some people say would be potentially why some people might want it to be the eve of Passover would be because the Passover lamb that gets slaughtered on Passover, I think the feast where the lamb is the lamb eaten? When's the lamb eaten? When do you eat the lamb? Is it Passover Eve or is it the day of Passover? That I don't know, but there is a time where the lamb gets slaughtered. You'd have to look that up because there's a timeline of when that's supposed to happen. And then people who believe that Jesus was the lamb that was slain, or Jesus represents the lamb that was slain, would want it to be the same timeline of when the Passover lamb would be slain. And then others wouldn't really care if that had a significance or not. But it was near Passover, nearby Passover. We don't know exactly what day, because even in the Gospels, there's some discrepancy there between is it the eve or is it not the eve of Passover. We don't know because the Christian Bible says different things. And so this says in the Talmud that it was the eve of Passover. And I'm going to look up this word, baraita. Baraita. I'm going to look that up because I don't know what that word is. Baraita definition. Jewish. In Judaism, a baraita is an ancient oral tradition of Jewish law that was not included in the Mishnah, the first authoritative codification of the Jewish law. So it's an oral tradition that was not written in the Mishnah. It wasn't written down, but it's an oral tradition. So there's an oral tradition that teaches that Jesus was, it's not written in the Mishnah, but there's an oral tradition that on Passover Eve they hung the corpse of Jesus. Now, what it says is they hung the corpse of Jesus, the Nazarene, after they killed him by way of stoning. The Bible does mention in the New Testament that I think there was a part where they picked up, was that against Jesus, where they started to pick up stones to try to stone him, but he ran away or something. Don't quote me on this, look it up yourselves. They either picked up, some of the religious leaders picked up stones to want to start trying to stone him when he said he was God, or they called him a blasphemer and were going to stone him, or started wanting to kill him. Or maybe this was with the woman caught in adultery, where they picked up stones to start trying to stone her. And then Jesus said, eventually after writing in the dirt, he says, who is without sin, cast the first stone. But she doesn't get stoned, and one by one the accusers kind of left. And there were a lot of attempts to try to trap Jesus, it seems like. But if you look at it from the other perspective, which we don't often do from a Christian lens, when you look at it from the perspective of these religious leaders, they raise good concerns. I mean, it's just from a Christian lens, it's hard to see it, because we're always taught in Christianity, oh, Jesus was in the right and they were in the wrong. But it's like, well, he was doing things that, someone in his position often was probably expected to submit and not do. Now, okay, say for example, take for example, if you follow a lot of ultra-religious Jewish, ex-ultra-religious Jewish people. So say if you follow some ultra-religious, it's disgusting. My car just got pooped on. This car's getting so pooped on. This is so disgusting. Now I'm spreading poop all over my windshields. Dude, these birds are pooping all over my car. That's not the first poop either. It's like the second or third one. This car's getting completely destroyed by bird poop. Okay, it looks clean enough. So basically, that's disgusting. Sorry, it's gross. I'm sitting here in the car and there's just a big bird poop that just got on my windshield. Right before my eyes. At least I'm in the car. Shoot, if I was sitting outside, I would have been getting pooped all over today. Anyways. Let's get back to this. Yeah, in Christian tradition, we're often taught that Jesus is the right one. But according to, okay, I haven't done this yet, but I would want to go through and read all the things that the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees had to say as complaints against Jesus. I would want to go through and just take out those quotes that they say. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Anything where they confront Jesus about some law that they say he's breaking. And I would want to go in and look up those laws in these actual, either the text or somewhere in the Torah or somewhere in the Old Testament, and see, pull the information from these ancient texts that these ancient religious leaders 2,000 years ago were using to try to approach Jesus about it. Because they were approaching him. Before Jesus, there was John the Baptist that was already in the wilderness baptizing people. And that storyline along like, his method, eventually he gets beheaded, unfortunately, but, I don't even remember the sequence of events that really led him to get beheaded, but I don't really know. Like, I think it was some family member, some lady in Herod's life, was it Herod, that decided that he needs to get beheaded because he allowed her to have, like, a wish or something, and she said that that's what she wanted. But I don't know, I don't remember if that was, arranged, or if that beheading was kind of, like, manipulated because of the Jewish religious leaders, if they were the ones who were like, hey, ask for his head on a platter kind of thing. I don't really remember, so I'd want to go back and look into that story. But John the Baptist got killed for some reason or another. Maybe because he was talking about the whole prepare a way, that there's going to be a new king or the Messiah or whatever is going to happen. Maybe that threatened Herod. I don't really know. I might be wrong on all of that. So look it up. Don't take my word for any of that, because I don't really know off the top of my head, and I don't want to go and look it up somewhere else. But these are just ideas that are coming to my mind as I'm reading this. I'm like, okay. I'd want to know what laws was Jesus breaking according to the Pharisees, because there were a lot of concerns that they had with him. Not just the Pharisees, but others. There were others that had concerns with him too. But what laws could we look up? All of those laws, and is there any backing to that? Are these things that even modern day that Jews would agree and be like, oh yeah, he was breaking the law. When the disciples were picking grain, he was breaking the law. Is that accurate or is it not accurate? Because it's easy to read it from, like, being raised Christian and be like, oh yeah, like, who cares if he was, like, picking grain, or who cares if he was doing this or that? Because Christians don't care about that kind of stuff. Now, modern day Jews might care about some of the stuff Jesus was doing, but I feel like some of it is even so ancient and left for, like, more rural areas. Like, I'm in LA. Like, I can't tell you the last time I saw a wheat field, I don't even know where the wheat fields are. Like, I don't even know where a wheat field is. If I had to go find a wheat field, if I even wanted to pick grain on the Sabbath, I don't even know how I'd get to one. Like, I don't even know where they exist. So, yeah. Was he hung on the eve of Passover? We don't know. There's some discrepancy even in the New Testament, but there are some reasons why potentially some people would have preferred him to be crucified or executed on certain days, because there's extra significance with the timeline of, like, the Jewish calendar. But I think everyone's in agreement that it was near Passover. If it was not on Passover, I think it was near Passover. So Passover does have its significance. Did they kill him by way of stoning? In the New Testament, Jesus never was stoned to death. There were, I think, threats to kill him. I think there were threats to stone him. I know there were threats to, like, there were plots to, like, test him and to, trap him. You hear that a lot, that they're trying to trap him. But I don't know. I feel like I've been introduced to Jewish culture enough to know that, rabbis challenge each other. That's not uncommon. Different sects of Judaism challenge each other sometimes. Now, they're not like, oh, let's have a formal debate. But you see the way that people dress differently and act differently and do different things differently. They all have their reason why they do it that way, and they don't do it the way that the other people do it. Even though from a Christian lens, like, it's really hard to really see any reason why. One thing, okay, let's talk about one thing in particular. If you look at the tzitzis, however you say it, with the tassels that you see Jews wearing off the side of their, there's a garment that they wear underneath where there's 4 corners of this garment, and each corner has these tassels on them. Sometimes you see a blue thread, sometimes you don't. There's reasons behind stuff like that. People who are Christians would just be like, oh, I see Jews, some wear this and some don't. But there's reasons why some people have the blue, some people don't have the blue. There's reasons why. And so, there's a lot that, when you're raised Christian, you just miss a lot of stuff. And so a lot of times we're taught to read the New Testament as Christians and be like, Jesus is right, he's the hero. Everyone else is trying to trap him and do him dirty. But it's like, is that really what was happening? I mean, yeah, he was mad and he was challenging the people. He was challenging these leaders, saying, like, beware of them, of their leaven and all, like, making them mad. Like, there were a lot of interactions during which, after, these leaders had interacted with Jesus, they were upset. And they showed that they were upset, and, they were kind of fuming about it after the fact. But I mean, if you've been in a religious environment where people argue about all kinds of stuff, I've been in churches where people were screaming about the drums in the middle of the service while the drums were being played for part of worship music, and there's people yelling in the background that the drums are evil or whatever, or the clapping or the dancing or whatever. And it's like, okay, like, people flip out, people flip. This isn't uncommon. There are a lot of people in religious environments that do get this, like, this bitterness. I've had that bitterness before too, on both ends, where I was like, why don't people want to follow, the Adventist ways? And then there was the other side where I was like, why can't this church be more lenient and more, accepting? And so I've been frustrated on both ends, and kind of gotten the best of myself with, verbalizing that and being pretty pissed off, and maybe regretted some of the things I said in a debate that might have turned into an argument at some point, or hurt feelings on my end or someone else's end. Just being in religious environments, sometimes people go pretty unchecked, or there's not really a culture of, like, peace and, like, compassion that's being, like, definitely, like, you have to be peaceful and compassionate. Like, people are allowed in some environments to argue. I remember going in San Diego to this one Adventist church that had a really cool Korean food potluck, and it was, I think I went to the Sabbath school, and I don't remember, there was some quarterly lesson, and I came in not right on time, but I came into this debate that was about the quarterly lesson, and these people were literally arguing about it. And then the teacher towards the end was like, oh, sorry to any of the visitors, but we kind of get a little bit heated here sometimes. And I was like, whoa, like, these people are mad. And like, but you see that it's not uncommon in religious environments for people to, like, debate, because it's hot topics. It's almost like talking politics. You can't bring up Trump or Kamala or Biden or Putin or whatever in just any circle and not have somebody want to, like, flip a lid about it. Like, it's, certain things you just can't talk about, and some people can't handle the conversations, or at that time in their life they're gonna want to debate and argue. So I don't really see, like, when I read the New Testament, I try to take it like that. Like, okay, like, these are religious people. They're going to debate. They're going to argue. There's going to be hurt feelings. Now, I've never been to a church where it was, like, at a point, somebody was like, now we need to kill this person. That was never the I've seen people leave churches. I've seen people go on Facebook and just be like, blah, like word vomit churches. I've seen all kinds of things and heard all kinds of things and read all kinds of things, but I've never seen murder carried out or like some kind of harm, physical harm, or killing or stoning. Like that in Christianity is not really common. In Judaism, I don't even know. I mean, you'd have to be deep in some kind of like very rare group. I don't even want to say that because I don't know. I've never heard of it with all that I've studied. I've never heard in 2024 these people got stoned to death or crucified or whatever. I mean, crucifixion was like a Roman thing, and it's like these people got stoned to death for praying to idols or whatever. I've heard about it in Arab cultures a little. Not maybe the stoning, maybe like people getting their hand chopped off or something. I've heard about it. I've never seen it. I've never witnessed it firsthand or even secondhand. It's just I've never heard about it in Judaism. I've never heard about it I think I've heard about it in some cultures. It does exist that there's some type of like killing for breaking laws and stuff that's more than what you would see in the US. Like it's but I don't even want to finish that sentence I was trying to say about if it happens in Judaism in modern day or not, because I really don't know, and I haven't heard anything like that. I've heard about it in some Arab cultures about things with women or things with homosexuality. In some cultures, people get killed or whatever it may be. And a lot of times there's some religious reason behind it maybe. But I don't think I've heard of... I don't know when people stopped stoning each other. The Torah does promote that, but I don't know if anyone practices it. I want to say, okay, so Stephen in the New Testament got stoned to death. I'm laughing because when I say stoned, we mean a different thing in California. When we say stoned, we mean that somebody was having a bunch of marijuana products. We're not talking about getting stoned like to death with rocks, and there's a process behind it too, but like public execution, like I don't know. It's not really a topic I enjoy, but I'm sorry, this is kind of dark now that I'm thinking about it. But so yeah, the part where it says a crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Now, 40 days before him. 40 days. So that means... I've never seen anything in the New Testament that says, okay, they accused him, and then 40 days later, they stoned him. Or there was a crier that went out before him for 40 days saying, oh, they're accusing him of this. Or when he got maybe arrested, there was like a 40-day period. I don't think I heard anything about that 40 days. There's not a story like that in the New Testament. And it also doesn't say that he practiced sorcery. Now, incited people to idol worship, that doesn't necessarily say that he was worshiping idols. It says incited other people to idol worship. And I don't even know what that's referring to. Now, I can see the accusation of sorcery, even though I don't think I ever heard of that in the New Testament either, where he was accused of sorcery. I think there was some questioning about where he does his by what authority does he have to do miracles, but it seemed like it was more so the miracles happening on the Sabbath. It wasn't necessarily that the miracles were happening, it's that the miracles were happening on the Sabbath. To my understanding, that was the issue. Now, I'm really wanting to actually go back and read all of the accusations and see kind of like what they were. I don't know. I don't want to go so deep into that, but I mean, I do kind of want to know what these accusations were of the Pharisees and things, because it's pretty interesting to me. He practiced sorcery. I don't know if he was accused of practicing sorcery. I think that missing part would be he performed miracles on the Sabbath. I don't know if they actually labeled it as sorcery in the New Testament. Now, people said it was miracles, but there were all kinds of miracles being done by all kinds of people. That wasn't necessarily... I don't think miracles in and of themselves were seen to be the evil doing. So that's interesting. I don't know where in the New Testament that is. I mean, you could say if you want to call miracles sorcery or other things like the Transfiguration, or I don't know, walking on water. I mean, there were certain things that happened that were like, okay, I could maybe see how somebody might be like, okay, it's one thing when you're healing someone, it's another thing when you're walking on water or transfiguring or doing things that are kind of just like, all right, that's... I'm not saying Jesus shouldn't have done that, but it is kind of like, I've often wondered why. Like, what was the point of some of the miraculous stuff? Like, what was the point of some of it? Like, the walking on water to me is an interesting one. Because was it Peter that came out to walk on water too? And he was able to do it for a little bit. Whoever it was that... Oh, another poop? Come on. This like... this is disgusting. I don't know. I'm gonna run out of wiper fluid. Wow. Back to back. I think I'm parked right under like a bird's nest or something. That's nature. So anyways, I don't know. The Talmud is kind of interesting here. Because there's a lot of stuff that's going on here that doesn't match up with what Christianity teaches. There's no mention of a person going out 40 days before. There's some discrepancy already in the New Testament about the execution being on the eve of Passover. The corpse of Jesus being hung after killing him by way of stoning. There was no mention of Jesus actually being stoned to death. And then hung where? Like, in the New Testament, he was crucified. He wasn't hung after, and he wasn't stoned. They didn't stone him, and he wasn't crucified. He wasn't hung after that. Like, he was hanging on the cross, but taken down pretty swiftly after the fact. And there wasn't like a 40-day period during which he'd been arrested or accused, during which they were saying, hey, somebody come forward. I don't think he incited people to idol worship either. I don't recall him doing any idol worship. And when did Jesus say to worship idols? I'm trying to think if that ever happened. Did Jesus encourage people to worship idols? Because the interesting thing is, Christianity teaches people to worship Jesus, but I don't remember Jesus ever saying to worship him. He never said, worship me, bow down and worship me. He taught the Lord's Prayer. It doesn't end in Jesus' name, amen. It doesn't say that. He never says in the Lord's Prayer, he never says anything. Let me see. Let me think about that a little bit more. He says, for thine is the kingdom and the glory and the power. He doesn't say in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He doesn't say that. I don't know where that first comes from. I don't know if that's biblical. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. I don't know if that's biblical. I don't know where that prayer came from. Now there is the part where Jesus does say, I am He, when they say that like, who are you? Who are you? Or like, I think there's a part where the disciples are conversing about who Jesus is, or Jesus is kind of like asking them who they think he is. And I think there's another part where the Pharisees are like, you're making yourself out to be God, saying that you're the Son of God or something like that. And then Jesus goes off and says something like, aren't we all called sons of God or something, and then goes off onto this whole speech about something that I don't really remember off the top of my head. But I guess their interpretation is that he made himself out to be God because he said, I am He at one point, and then there was something that he was doing or saying where he made himself out to be God. But but I don't ever remember Jesus saying for people to worship him. He never said, bow down and worship me. That was a whole other thing. I don't think Jesus ever said that. I don't think Jesus ever taught to worship him or encouraged worship of him or told people to worship him. I really don't ever think I saw or heard of that anywhere in the New Testament. So which idols was he telling people to worship? I mean, even in the Lord's Prayer, it starts out, Our Father who art in heaven, or whatever version of that, in whatever language, Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever language was being spoken, whatever the interpretation of that is, it starts out, Our Father, it starts out about God. And there's nowhere in there that says Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or anywhere in the prayer that Jesus teaches that teaches anyone to pray to any other thing. Now what the content of the prayer is, praying for the coming of the kingdom, whatever that might mean, however that's interpreted. Some people say it's the kingdom that's supposed to come in the Messianic age. Some people say it's an earthly kingdom. There's so many interpretations of what the Lord's Prayer means, but none of it says worship Jesus, and Jesus never said worship Jesus. And even if people can argue that Jesus said he was God or affirmed that he was God, he never told anyone to worship him. And so I don't really know. I don't really know. I don't really know in the New Testament where he would have been telling people to worship idols. I mean, if this is all taken from what's called Baraita, if this is all taken from what's called Baraita, which is an oral explanation, an oral tradition, if this is all taken from an oral tradition, then this is what is orally being taught. This is what's orally being taught. I don't know who is teaching it, who says it. The Mishnah talks about this crier, but then the Baraita is all this other stuff. The oral tradition part of it, it says the Gemara raises a difficulty, but isn't it taught in a Baraita? And then it says all this other stuff about the eve of Passover, the corpse being hung after being stoned to death, and then the crier going out for 40 days beforehand, with all of these accusations, saying that Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Which I would say maybe two of them, you can't really prove two of those based on the New Testament. But if this is the oral interpretation of what Jesus was doing, that's a whole different argument. Like, we're talking about an oral tradition that's taught about what Jesus the Nazarene did, which is a baraita that teaches about what Jesus the Nazarene did, and trying to compare that to New Testament writings that were written decades after Jesus was even alive. They don't match up. This baraita does not match up to the New Testament. And even, I mean, I'm like, even trying to make it work. Like, the examples I've given with like, and I'm not like very detailed with like the actual quotes and everything, but I would just say the next step would be to look in the New Testament and see what Jesus was accused of, all the accusations during all of the four Gospels, all of the accusations that were made, and see if any of them fit in any of these categories. I would say the leading Jewish people astray. I mean, yeah, leading them off of the traditional path. You see this with Amish culture, you know. There's a tradition where they follow, and there's multiple traditions from the ordnungs from multiple churches. So when we say Amish, it's like, it depends which ordnung we're looking at. Each ordnung is different for each different community, which is why you have so many differences. But then when enough people disagree on something, they create a new community. And that seems kind of what happened here, is that Jesus made it so there was a different Jewish community. Because mind you, at this time they weren't different from Jews. At this time, Christians were following the commandments. You know, early Christians were Jews. Some of them weren't, but the early Christians were Jews. And so they were doing this other thing, all these other things that Jesus was teaching. And obviously it was stirring up some conflict with the religious leaders of that time. But it's hard to know how accurate were their accusations. That's the part that I think is going to be hard to figure out. How accurate were the accusations of these people? Because you know how it is when people argue and you get one side of a story. Even if you were there, you know, when someone has hurt feelings, they're going to be like, well, they did this and they said that and they did. And you're like, I was there. They never said that. They didn't do that. They didn't do that other thing that you just said, you know. Or they didn't mean it in that way. Or like, when someone has hurt feelings, they're going to embellish, you know. That's how I feel. When someone has hurt feelings or jealousy or anger, they're going to, oftentimes, if they're not checking themselves, they're going to embellish when they're telling those stories. You know, I vent my frustration sometimes, but, you know, I do try to own up to my end of things. Like, I was recently talking about, you know, some hurt feelings over a situation where, you know, I took on some work from a friend's mom, and she hired me to do some things, and I didn't feel like I was being treated well or things like that. But I also learned, don't go into business with friends or moms of your friends. And you already know that that's kind of, you know, people teach you not to do that. That's kind of a common saying, don't go into business with friends or family. And then, you know, I still decided to try to go into business with them, and I also stayed. I didn't quit at the first issue. I stuck around for a while, to the point where I couldn't stand it. But it was like, those were my decisions. I said yes. I took on the task. I took on the work. I took on the jobs. And I continued to be treated badly by staying in this position and not quitting or leaving early. Those were my decisions. So yeah, they treated me bad. But yeah, I said I would do it. And yes, I stayed long enough to be hurt multiple times. So I did have a role in that. And I'm not saying that makes them more right or me more right. It's just how it was, and I can look at it now and own up to that kind of stuff. But, when I've had hurt feelings in the past about certain things, I haven't always been like, oh yeah, like, I haven't always been, so understanding of the problems. So, or agreed that I had any role in something going wrong. Like, it's easy to be like, oh, this person wronged me. And it's like, yeah, they did wrong me, but I stayed. I opted into the job. I went against what I thought was going to be a good job choice for myself. And I was like, I was hesitant, but I was like, yeah, I'll do it. And it was a bad job decision, on my end. And I learned a lesson from that. And a very important lesson, whereas to now, I do not go into business with friends or family of friends or whatever. I've definitely said no to some things, and I'm like, if I hadn't had that experience, I might not have said no to some other things that came up more recently. So I can own up to stuff like that now that the pain is kind of like in the past. It's an experience that I can talk about, but I don't think I'm fully holding a grudge, but I was for a while. So I do think when people have a grudge to hold, they're not going to be very accurate a lot of times unless they kind of check themselves, or unless, they're able to kind of like, find some peace in it later on down the road. So it says, okay, basically it says, and the court did not find a reason to acquit him, and so they stoned him and hung his corpse on Passover Eve. Dude, every time I look up, this car's getting pooped on. I just got pooped on again on my driver's side and on the mirror. I think this is a sign for me to leave this section. Like, I'm getting pooped all over. Dang it. Who's pooping on my car? I might need to move up a little bit. I moved my car back. Because I felt like I had a little more privacy with this hedge here. But now I'm getting pooped on. Because there's too many trees. I'll deal with that later. Now Ula, it says Ula said, this is in 21. Ula said, how can you understand this proof? Now Ula, I don't know who Ula is. You can look that up. Who's Ula in the Talmud? Was Jesus the Nazarene worthy of conducting a search for a reason to acquit him? Now, was there something that he did that made it so that he got, I guess, reviewed by the court or whatever it may be? It says he was an insider to idol worship. I don't know where in the New Testament it would say that. He was an insider to idol worship, and the Merciful One states, with regard to an insider to idol worship, neither shall you spare, neither shall you conceal him. Deuteronomy 13:9. Rather, Jesus was different, as he had close ties with the government, and the Gentile authorities were interested in his acquittal. That is weird. That's just weird to read. So I don't know how Jesus would have been an insider of idol worship. That part if this is the same person we're talking about, this Jesus of the New Testament, I don't understand how he would have been inciting people to idol worship. This quote from Deuteronomy 13:9 Now, in the recent Torah portions that has come up in recent weeks, the parts about idol worship, I just don't remember them off the top of my head. But there was a portion, maybe this last week was Kitete or something like that. The week before, it was either the week before or the week before that, maybe. It was talking about, when you go into this land, not to be like involved with the idols of the promised land. And I did have the question of, do idols have any kind of power? Because if they didn't have any power, why is God always saying, like, smash them, tear them down, don't get anywhere near them, don't pray to them, don't learn about them, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if it says don't learn about them, but don't engage with them, basically. It says Jesus was different as he had close ties with the government. Did Jesus have close ties with the government? I don't recall that happening in the New Testament. And the Gentile authorities were interested in his acquittal. Now, why would Gentile authorities be interested in Jesus being, harmed? I would see Jewish authorities might have had that interest, but Gentile authorities, I don't know. Unless it's like the part where it's, and I'm reaching here, but unless we're talking about that Jesus was saying, that there's beliefs that Jesus is the Messiah and that there's some kind of kingship potentially about to occur where Jesus might be the new king of the Jews or something like that. I'm reaching here, but I'm just saying, if the Gentile leadership heard that there's going to be a king of the Jews, that could have been an issue. And I think the New Testament does speak to that, that there were some leaders that weren't happy. Because Herod in the beginning, didn't he try to kill all the baby boys? And then, because he heard about this boy king or something. And then, I think later on it was like a Roman ruler that was kind of like, no, we can't have this. So, if that's what they mean by Gentile authorities, consequently, the court gave him every opportunity to clear himself so that he could not be claimed that he was falsely convicted. So they gave him every opportunity to clear himself, and then there was somebody sent out 40 days beforehand saying if anybody has any way of like helping out this situation with some kind of proof, then you can get involved too and kind of like vouch for this guy. So that's all I really have to say on this one, even though it's freaking long. I'm sorry, but that's all I can really say because I don't really know. This is my first stab at this. Sanhedrin 43a. We looked at 20 and 21, and I will post this link. You got to scroll down a while from this link. I took it from sepharia.org under the section for sepharia.org, under the section under the section Sanhedrin, and then it has them usually with the numbers. It has chapters and it has numbers. It usually has an A and a B. Now the name here, they say Jesus the Nazarene. The rabbi, I'm going to post his link to Rabbi of Jews for Judaism link. So on, and on his teaching, he basically says, Yeshu. So I'm just gonna post those. So you can read it. I hope I did a decent job of explaining how this may or may not be accurate. I don't even know. We don't know if we're talking about the same Jesus here. So whatever it may be, I just found it was interesting, because I was always wondering, okay, like, I guess it started out with me wondering, like, why don't Jews see Jesus as the Messiah? Like, what is it that when they read the New Testament, what are they seeing different? Other than the discrepancies, I guess that was the first thing that ever stuck out to me, was like, how come these quotes that are in the New Testament where somebody says, oh, the prophets say, or this or that, and then I see the footnotes of like what Bible passage to look up, and I go and look it up, and the Bible passage, I don't know what percentage of the time, but sometimes the Bible passage was different in the Old Testament than what that quote was in the New Testament. Or sometimes the quote doesn't, I found out later that there are things that people say the Torah says, or the law says, or the Hebrew scriptures say, or something like that. And then like that verse doesn't exist in the Hebrew scriptures, that people are like making it up, that there were people making up those scriptures or something to say that, oh, it says this in the prophets or whatever, and there's no quote like that in the prophets. Now I'm getting that from a rabbi who's saying that those quotes don't exist. Now, if I go back and read the whole Old Testament just to try to search for those one like sentences or phrases or quotes, will I be able to find it? Because I have seen some portions where it'll be like maybe 3 or 4 of the words in sequence are kind of the same, but then it's like, this isn't the same quote. Like, it's not talking about the same thing. Or like, how did you get this out of that? Like, it's like, so that was one thing that stuck out. And then another thing, I was always wondering, like, in detail, why do Jews not believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And I guess it's according to a lot of passages in the Old Testament as well as in the Talmud. I have an episode on this about the messianic beliefs, not messianic Jews, but the people who are waiting for the Messiah, and kind of what the Messiah is supposed to meet criteria for, and how the Jews interpret that is different than how Christians interpret that. And there's stuff that Christians add in, like the miracles and the virgin birth and all kinds of stuff like that, that isn't necessarily what Jews would say makes somebody a Messiah or not. Like, just because someone has a virgin birth or does miracles or whatever, like, doesn't necessarily mean that they're the Messiah. And here's another poop. I'm gonna get out of here, guys. This is long enough, but I hope for people who are looking for this information, I'm not like a scholar. I'm not like a trained scholar. I'm just a nerd. And I like to learn things, and I have a long history being involved with church and reading scriptures, and so I enjoy this kind of stuff. And that's mostly why I'm on here posting these things. I don't really have any other reason why I'm posting this stuff other than that I enjoy doing it. And I enjoy learning about it, and I'm more motivated to do that if I have a platform to post on about it. But I'm not saying that I'm always right. That's why I always say, look it up yourself, find it yourself. I could be wrong. I'm not quoting things exactly as they are. A lot of times I'm paraphrasing or just explaining my own opinions about things. So don't like take what I said and go and run with it and be like, oh, this is definitely what the Bible says, and I need to think about it the way that I heard about it on this podcast. I would just say this is oftentimes food for thought. I'm gonna go next into 43a22. I also want to post. I want to see. So the guy whose Talmud lessons I often follow, I want to see what he says. What he says on his episodes. If I can find those links to this Sanhedrin 43a under some lessons that he's already put out, I'll definitely post those too. Because if you like this, you'd probably like that. If you like the Jews for Judaism guy, you probably like this other guy. He's the one who does Merkaz Daf, the 8-minute Daf, or it's called Merkaz Daf, D-A-F, but MERCAZ DAF. So if I can find the same teaching on his YouTube channel, just the Sanhedrin 43a, I might go back and listen to what he says and see if there's anything worth posting from what he says on